So today I'm going to be talking about a couple of different pests, and all of them are different sort of types of fruit flies or things that we colloquially call fruit flies. So I'm going to have some updates on black fig fly, which is over on the left, and then a number of different invasive fruit fly species for which there are different quarantines that can be put in place if they are found, like oriental fruit fly pictured on the right. So as an outline of the different things that we're going to be going over, first off, I'm going to be talking about those invasive fruit flies, the suite of different fruit flies that when they show up, CDFA and the counties put out quarantines to try to prevent them from establishing. So we're going to talk about identification for some of the most common ones and some of the current quarantines that are out there, a little bit about their biology, the host that they can attack, the damage they cause, the two current quarantines that are now in place in the state, and then also some best practices for growers and also members of the public if these are here and if you are in a quarantine area. Then I'll talk a little bit about black fig fly, which was also pictured in the background of this slide. Black fig fly, we'll talk about identification and biology, and then a bit more about monitoring and management, which unfortunately there still isn't a lot of good information on. That's something that research is ongoing with. But let's start off with these invasive fruit flies to begin with. When it comes to these invasive fruit flies, again, there's numerous species of these fruit flies that enter California on a regular basis. There are some that are already established here. There's a bunch that aren't established here, and the ones that aren't established here are the ones we're going to be talking about today. Those include oriental fruit fly, med fly, which is also known as Mediterranean fruit fly, Mex fly, which is also known as Mexican fruit fly. There's Tau fly, Queensland fruit fly, melon fly, Caribbean fruit fly, guava fruit fly, and white striped fruit fly. And I believe those are all the main ones that are currently kind of being monitored by CDFA as these highly damaging invasive pests. All of them are invasive tiferated fruit flies, and as I said, are highly damaging. They attack a wide range of different fruits and can be very, very problematic. And because of that, when they are found in the state, quarantines are put up to prevent the establishment of these pests to make sure they don't become this kind of permanent fixture here that we have to deal with forever because they are quite damaging. With that being said, there are some fruit flies, even invasive fruit flies, that are already here and already established in the state. Olive fruit fly is an example of one that's already here, and so there's not the same sort of level of quarantines that are in place around it. So olive fruit fly is problematic, but we're not going to be talking about that one today. We're going to be talking instead about these other different invasive fruit flies. So some of the common ones of these invasive fruit flies that we're most likely to see, depending on where you are located in California. Medfly is definitely one of the most common ones. It's also one of the most damaging agricultural pests in the world. Oriental fruit fly is another one. And then especially down south here where I am, Mex fly has shown up a number of different times too. So it depends on where you are in the state, but all of these show up relatively frequently. The adults are kind of these medium-sized to a bit larger flies. So here's a picture of a Mex fly adult female, pictured next to a penny, just to give you kind of a sense of scale. The Mex flies are a little bit bigger than the oriental fruit flies or the med flies, but generally speaking, they're kind of large flies. Here they are, pictured over here. All of them will have, well, not always, but they usually have these kind of visible wing patterns on them. The med fly and the Mex fly have that. And then oftentimes they'll have these visible ovipositors on the female. So kind of this large stinger-like thing in the back. That's what they use to lay their eggs inside of fruit. So up top, we have the medfly. They tend to be a little bit more compact. Their thorax is that kind of blackish color. Their abdomen's a little bit orangish. They have a little bit of wing patternation on them. And generally speaking, they have a smaller ovipositor. So not a really long one. It's not this super obvious kind of stinger-like thing. Oriental fruit fly down in the bottom right corner. They're a little bit more wasp-like. They sort of look, yeah, not quite as, stereotypically fly-like and look maybe a bit more like a yellow jacket or something like that. They won't have wing patterns, and they'll have these kind of yellow markings on their body as well as a sort of T shape on the abdomen as well. And then Mex fly is a little bit more distinctive, where they have these wing patterns and kind of a V and S shape on both of their wings, and they have that really long distinctive ovipositor when they are females. So generally speaking, that's kind of what you'd be looking out for with these flies, but again, there's a whole lot of different species that could potentially be problematic. Beyond the adults, here's what their larvae look like. These are usually going to be inside of fruit. They're these kind of small, whitish grubs. They'll narrow a little bit towards one end, and they look very, very similar to a whole bunch of other fly larvae. So it's really, really hard to tell these apart from anything else. They don't have any legs, they don't have any eyes or distinctive head, and you're also very unlikely to see these because they're going to be hidden inside of the fruit. The pupae also are pretty nondescript overall. They're very similar to many other fly species. They're also found in the soil because the larvae will get into the soil to pupate. So again, you're really not likely to see these either, but this is what they look like in case you're curious about that, or in case you split open fruit and start finding this, it is possible that these are from invasive fruit flies. Now, there are other fruit flies that aren't a problem that are present here in California. They have different types of wing patterns, they have different colors, but they can be quite hard to tell apart. So this one, Trupania bisetosa, is a species of fruit fly that I've just seen hanging around. It's not really a problem for anything. It's not an actual pest. Another one that looks actually quite a bit like Mex fly, which is Zososomata vitigera, is also around here and present. So just the point of all this is that there definitely can be things that look like these invasive fruit flies that you might kind of, see it and start worrying about it. Not always the case, so just be aware of that. And some of the other ones, again, like olive fruit fly, which is a problematic pest was established here, kind of looks a lot like oriental fruit fly as well. So there's a lot of opportunities for misidentification and stuff like that. The thing to take away from this is that most differentiated fruit flies you see are not going to be invasive pests. And of those that are pests, even fewer of them are going to lead to the quarantines that we're about to talk about. So again, just because you see something that looks like one of these doesn't mean you should necessarily be freaking out. You should be vigilant for stuff, but be aware there's lots of opportunities for misidentification. So be vigilant, but don't worry too much if you start seeing flies that look like this around. Generally speaking, what is the life cycle for these invasive fruit fly? This is an example with oriental fruit fly. So the adult females will lay their eggs underneath the skin of fruit. Using that ovipositor, they'll insert them underneath the skin of fruit. And for oriental fruit flies, they can lay up to 1,000 eggs per female. Mex flies is even more. It's about 1,500. So they can be quite fecund and lay quite a few eggs. These eggs then hatch into larvae, which burrow into the fruit. They start digging tunnels into it, and they begin to consume it from the inside out. Once they've grown enough, the larvae leave the fruit, they drop to the ground, and they pupate in the soil, and then those emerge as adults to repeat the whole life cycle all over again. In warm weather, for oriental fruit fly, it takes about 30 days to complete a full life cycle. In cooler weather, it takes around 100 days. And broadly speaking, that's similar for medfly and mexfly as well. So some of the most common ones, generally speaking, about a month in warm weather, and then like 3, maybe 4 months in cooler weather. So it's all temperature dependent. For oriental fruit fly, there's a whole lot of hosts. There's a full list that's at this QR code right here, but there's about 250 species, and it's basically almost all the different fruits you could think of can be affected by things like oriental fruit fly. Citrus, avocados, essentially all temperate fruits, so stone fruits and apples and pears and all those different things. Basically all tropical and subtropical fruits that are grown here. That also includes nuts and coffee, which you might not normally think of as being fruits, but definitely do have that exterior that these fruit flies can use as hosts. Grapes can also be attacked by oriental fruit fly, as can peppers, squash, tomatoes, and eggplant. So it's a huge amount of stuff that can be grown here. And in fact, for oriental fruit fly, it's a bit easier to think of what it can't attack instead. So it doesn't go after strawberries and olives, but basically everything else you could think of, oriental fruit fly will go after. This is also very similar to what medfly does. Medfly attacks almost everything in the same way that oriental fruit fly does. Mexfly is a little bit different. Again, if you want to see all the hosts, it's here. The host range is a bit smaller, but they will go after basically all citrus, except for, strangely, not Lisbon or Eureka lemons. They'll go after avocados, except for Hass, which for most people is pretty useful because that's one of the most commonly grown ones. They'll go after apples, pears, plums, a whole bunch of other different tropical, subtropical fruits, and then also nuts and coffee and things like that as well. So quite a broad host range for mexfly, although not quite as broad as oriental fruit fly or as Mediterranean fruit fly or medfly. So why are they such an issue? We talked a little bit about this, but the damage they cause is pretty significant. Females tend to prefer damaged fruit or overripe fruit. They can attack perfectly healthy fruit, but generally speaking, they'll go after what's a little bit easier. So if your fruit's a little bit more damaged, if it's a little bit more, susceptible to them, they'll go after that. Once they lay eggs inside of it, you can sometimes see little dark spots from the oviposition on the outside of the fruit, but these are pretty hard to find. You'd have to be looking quite carefully in most cases. As we talked about, the larvae then tunnel through the fruit. They leave holes, they'll damage it in their own right, but also you get secondary infection in the damaged tissue. So the fruit begins to spoil and decay. And obviously that's a very serious issue because this is healthy fruit that is being attacked by these fruit flies. In terms of economic damage in California, for the most damaging ones like Oriental fruit fly and medfly, it's over like basically $17 billion of gross value of crops that can be affected by these pests. So very, very serious impact, potential to be highly damaging across many different regions and for many different growers of many different crops. And beyond that, of course, there's a huge number of residential fruit trees, gardens, things like that. So it's not just on the agricultural side that many of you are working with, but this is also a very serious problem for basically all residents of California as well. Okay, so we've established what the damage is. We've established what the different pests are. What triggers the quarantine? Because we don't want these establishing and spreading. These are pests that CDFA monitors for. So when do we actually get a quarantine in place for them? CDFA monitors, as do multiple county agencies. They put out these traps. They know that these fruit flies show up on occasion, so they have these things out and are preemptively monitoring for them. They monitor for a number of different invasive pests. These fruit flies are but one of them. So they put out these traps with pheromones, like the one pictured over here. There's a little sort of cage-like thing up on top with a pheromone, and then a sticky card underneath where the fruit flies will fly in and get caught. If any fruit flies are found by CDFA or the county, then they start putting out more traps. They increase the trapping efforts, which is called delimitation, basically trying to figure out where exactly this fruit fly infestation is and to trap more intensively to figure out, how big of an issue it is. A quarantine and eradication will be triggered if, in the case of, say, Oriental fruit fly, there's 6 Oriental fruit fly found in rural areas or 8 of them found in urban areas, and these flies have to be within the same life cycle and within 3 miles of each other. Another thing that will trigger a quarantine is if they find one mated female or one larvae or pupa, or larva or pupa, excuse me. And basically what that is that indicates that there's a breeding population of these flies. So this varies by the different fruit fly species. It's a little bit different for Mex fly. It's a little bit different for med fly. But generally speaking, if you find like more than 5 of these fruit flies, or if you find anything that indicates a breeding population, that's when a quarantine and eradication is triggered. And you can sort of see the logic behind this is that sometimes maybe 1 or 2 fruit flies will get in and they'll die off. But if they're starting to establish a breeding population, that's when you actually have to worry about it. So you're looking for indicators that there is a breeding population, and that's when the quarantine is triggered. There are 2 current quarantines for invasive fruit flies that are happening right now in the state. One is for Mediterranean fruit fly or medfly. That's in Santa Clara and Alameda counties, basically centered around San Jose, up around by the Bay Area. And the other is for Oriental fruit fly, which is in Riverside and San Bernardino counties, more down south, closer to where I am based. So the medfly quarantine started in November of 2025, and the Oriental fruit fly one was a little bit ago in September of 2025. So both of them pretty recent, both of them are ongoing, and I believe the Mediterranean fruit fly quarantine also just expanded relatively recently. So these are the 2 ones that are active. If you're in these general areas, hopefully you already know about this. If you don't, now you do. And it's definitely something you should be paying attention to because it definitely will affect growers and residents in these different areas. Okay, so when there are these quarantines in place, basically this is around 5-mile radius around where these are found, then we have eradication efforts that are put in place. So CDFA and USDA come in and they do fruit removal for all residential properties within half a mile of a larval detection or sort of this core area of the quarantine area. All the fruit on all the trees is stripped off and disposed of. And again, you see the logic of this basically is that if you get rid of the things that these can use as hosts that they're reproducing in, then hopefully you've killed them off. So in that small area, you get rid of all the fruit. Then they do insecticide applications for all properties within 200 meters of a detection. And that basically is spinosad with protein bait. So the protein bait attracts females. GF120 Naturalite is basically what they always use because it's an organic option that's also available for growers to use. It's put down, the females will go to it to feed on the protein, they then ingest the spinosad and they die. So these insecticide applications then in this slightly bigger area, those get hit and try to kill off any of the females that are out there looking for protein. Then there's the really cool side of it, which is looking at killing off the males or making it so that the population can no longer breed. So for Oriental fruit fly, they use male attractant technique. And basically what that is that they have methyl eugenol, which is very attractive to males. They mix that with spinosad and they apply it at the rate of 600 bait stations per square mile. So they basically go around putting these little blobs on utility poles of a little bit of methyl eugenol and a little bit of spinosad. It's up above where basically anyone can reach, so the public doesn't go and touch it, even though it's quite safe. But then The male fruit flies are attracted to the methyl eugenol. They then touch the spinosad and they die. So they're attracted, they're killed, and basically you wipe out all the males so the population can't breed. That's what happens with oriental fruit fly. For medfly and for mexfly, they do sterile male releases. So basically, CDFA is breeding huge numbers of these fruit flies in captivity. And then they irradiate them to sterilize them. They mark their little heads, like they basically coat the pupae with a little fluorescent powder. So when the flies emerge, there's this little dot on their head that you can see under a black light. So you know that those are the sterilized ones. And then they release these sterile males at the rate of 250,000 per square mile in the quarantine area per week. So there ends up being millions and millions of these sterile males being released. And again, you can sort of understand the logic here then, where there's suddenly the only males that any of these female fruit flies can find to mate with are ones that have been released and are sterile. The population then fizzles out because they can't reproduce. So it's actually a really, really cool system. And you can see all three of these together, some fruit removal, the spinosad baits to attract and kill the females. And then depending on the fruit fly species, this effort to kill or sterilize all the males works quite well for eradication for all of these. So again, this is done without the growers, but there is an expectation for growers in the quarantine zone to also be doing things themselves. So when it comes to grower control measures, usually, and this depends a little bit, but if you're in this kind of core area of a really bad infestation and fruit flies are found on site, in some cases you can't move your fruit at all. So if you were the epicenter of an infestation, you might not be able to move your fruit at all. If the flies weren't on your particular property, then there's a very good chance you're going to be able to move the fruit if you do a couple things. And for the most part, what that is doing insecticide applications once a week, one fruit fly life cycle before harvest. This again varies on temperature, but generally speaking, that means 30 days in warm weather or 100 days if it's cooler. If, for example, a quarantine started and you don't have time to do insecticide applications 1 week before life cycle, once a week before one life cycle before harvest, you might just be out of luck and you might not be able to move your fruits. So in most cases, you're going to be okay, but it is something to be aware of. So you do insecticide applications once a week, one life cycle before harvest. That can be malathion or spinosad, and basically, again, you're doing these insecticides combined with the protein bait. So what happens is that you'll do this kind of the grid of X's over here is indicative of, say, like a grove of trees. You'd be applying the bait on the perimeter of your entire grove, and then on a couple of the trees kind of spaced randomly throughout the interior. So you don't have to apply it to like every single tree, but the idea is you kind of make a perimeter on the outside and then also treat some of the trees on the inside. And this should be effective in killing off most of the female fruit flies if there are any present in your area. There are also some options for post-harvest treatment. This was the case with oriental fruit fly in the latest quarantine down here in Riverside, basically where you could do 48 hours treatment with phosphine gas and then a 5-day cold treatment. They had some facilities where you could actually do that. So there are additional options to try to sort of make sure you could ship things, even if maybe you weren't able to do insecticide applications once a week, one life cycle before harvest. Additionally, there's a couple other things for sort of packing requirements. If you're in any areas that have Asian citrus psyllida and huanglongbing, the packing requirements that you have to do already covers these fruit flies. And basically that's like making sure that the shippers, the receivers know what's happening. You're going to remove all the different stems and leaves from the fruit, and you're also tarping and covering the whole thing during transit to make sure that fruit flies can't find it. So generally speaking, that's what you're doing in cases like this with fruit flies. And then also you should, if you can, dispose of any fallen fruit that is in your grove, because damaged fruit is something that the fruit flies are more likely to go to. If you are going to be disposing of your fruit, then you're going to be trying to bury it at least 2 feet deep, because otherwise the larvae can emerge, pupate, and still get to the surface. That's definitely something that could be quite difficult, but it is something to consider if you're quite concerned about it, or if you're in kind of one of those epicenters and it really is a big problem for you. How long do these quarantines last? All right, this is all based on life cycles and detections of these different fruit flies. So when quarantines will end, about 3 to 4, depends on the fruit fly species, but 3 to 4 full life cycles of a fruit fly with no new detections in an area. So basically it's like, okay, if we've gone through 3 or 4 life cycles and we haven't found any more, then we're pretty sure it's been eradicated, the quarantine can end. So if no new fruit flies are detected, the quarantine ends, and that usually is around 6 to 9 months. But if more flies are found, the quarantine can expand and it can be prolonged. So if you've gone, say 6 months, you're almost there, and then suddenly find another fruit fly, then you're back to the square one again. You have to go another 3 to 4 full life cycles. Quarantines have been very effective in the past. So these fruit flies were introduced multiple times across the state. Basically, the last year, 2023 to 2024, was a particularly bad year where quite a few of these were showing up, and there was a very large infestation in San Bernardino and Riverside in the Redlands area. Even in a case like that, where there was like hundreds of these fruit flies present, they were able to be eradicated, they were able to be contained. So these efforts do actually work quite well, and they are burdensome for some people, but they are pretty effective at keeping these things from spreading. There's also a couple other things. CDFA is looking to other options to try to help control things like, say, soil drenches of insecticide for the pupae. But again, for the most part, the tools that are already in place work pretty well, and the quarantines, generally speaking, only last 6 to 9 months, maybe a year at most. Okay, so again, grower best practices. What should you do? First off, if you are in the quarantine, of course, abide by all rules and regulations. But additionally, if you're in these general areas and around there, things that you should be thinking about. So if you're near to a quarantine area, definitely consider, of course, checking regularly if the quarantine area is changing. So if you now are in a quarantine zone and you weren't before, possibly put out your own traps to monitor for these fruit flies. That's definitely something you can consider. If it's feasible, cleaning up fallen fruit is definitely a good preventative thing. Don't be like the picture in the background here if you can, although I understand that that can be quite difficult in many cases because, of course, fallen fruit acts as attractant. It's a place to reproduce, but it's also a big hassle to clean it up sometimes. Preventative bait treatments on the edge of your groves might also be a good idea. So putting out some of that GF120 natural light, the spinosad bait with an attractant can be helpful to help prevent them from establishing in the first place. And do report any fruit fly sightings to CDFA, even if it is in your grove. And I know that's a really unfortunate thing. That's a really bad situation to be in, but it's much worse to have an infestation grow than to try to get it early. Because if this really starts to grow out of hand, then it affects much more people. It becomes a much bigger issue for you. So if you do find them, it's not great, but it is definitely the best thing to report it to CDFA. For the public in general, there's a couple other best practices. If they're in a quarantine area, the members of the public shouldn't be moving fruit or host plants. So, don't be like bringing fresh fruit from inside the quarantine zone to give to one of your friends outside of it, unless it's cooked, frozen, or processed. Any of that will kill off fruit fly larvae inside of it. Dispose of fruit correctly, which basically means, unfortunately, throwing it out or burying it deeply and not composting it because the fruit flies can then emerge. And then in general, something I always try to tell the public is, of course, don't bring in uninspected agricultural products because that is how most invasive species come into the state. They come from the public, bringing in unregulated fruit, unregulated plants, etc. So that is why most of these infestations are not centered around commercial groves. They're centered around residential areas because that is how they get in here. That's how they start. And for the public as well, they should report invasive fruit fly sightings to CDFA. All right, for more information on all of this, the CDFA website on fruit flies is definitely one of the best places to go. It's updated, it has maps, so you can see if you're actually in quarantine zones and things like that. It has information on the quarantines, control efforts, and stuff. This is almost certainly one of the best sources overall. So CDFA website on fruit flies, which is listed up here, or if you just look up CDFA invasive fruit flies, you'll find it pretty easily. All right, let's then talk a little bit about black fig fly to finish up. A bit about identification biology, and then some of the monitoring and management. So black fig fly, which is pictured on the right-hand side over here, is Silba adipata. It was first detected in California in 2021 and then has been spreading quite a bit throughout the state since then. It's originally from the Mediterranean, and it's a pretty serious pest of figs there. And fortunately, it only affects figs as far as we are aware. So it's not this really sort of cosmopolitan fruit fly like the other things we were talking about where it has a really broad host range. Black fig fly is pretty darn specific to figs. Adult females lay their eggs inside of unripe fruit. So they're not going after ripe fruit, they're going after still green, still very much unripe fruit. The larvae then start to eat little bits of it from the inside, and this causes premature fruit drop. So your figs will start dropping off your tree before they're anywhere close to ripe, and you'll lose crop that way. The larvae then exit out of these little kind of pinholes in the sides of the figs. They'll then pupate in the ground and they'll emerge again. Adults will feed on the latex sap of figs, so they'll also just be kind of flying around figs, not just to lay their eggs, but also to feed as well. There's generally about 4 to 6 generations per year, depending on temperature, weather, all that stuff. And generally speaking, it begins in the spring, and they start to correspond with when figs are present and available. So across the state, here's the black fig fly distribution. The areas in green are areas where black fig fly has been confirmed by CDFA, and these little sort of hatched purple areas in Merced and Madera counties are the main fig producing counties. So it started down here in Southern California, and it's now spread up into more kind of central California and into those areas with figs. So it was first found in LA and Santa Barbara in 2021. It's now established throughout SoCal. It's also present down in Mexico as well. And then, as I said, it's been found sort of around the Bay Area and getting into parts of the Central Valley. It's not yet, as far as I'm aware, in these like major fig groves and major fig growing regions becoming a serious problem, but it probably will be very soon. It's spread a lot. In just a couple years, it's likely to continue to spread. And I think these major fig growing regions are going to be affected realistically pretty soon. So there are control efforts. There's definitely monitoring efforts up there, but it is already present in some of these counties where the major fig production is. So when we come to black fig fly identification, it's going to be really hard to identify the adults. You're unlikely to see them as well. They're just kind of like small black flies, and they look similar to a lot of other flies. So instead, unfortunately, you're probably going to be trying to look for symptoms first, and that's often the things that are going to be appearing first. So again, you're looking for unripe fallen fruit. If you just have unripe fallen fruit that's coming to the ground, that's almost certainly going to be black fig fly, especially if you look at it and you start seeing these kind of tiny pinprick-like exit holes in the fruit. That is almost certainly, again, black fig fly. If you cut it open, then you'll start to see these tunnels in the fruit, these little tunneled out areas or kind of sections where it's kind of filled with this darkish brown material. That is also very indicative of black fig fly. And oftentimes you'll find these little larvae inside. Again, nondescript, no legs, no head, a little kind of blackish part towards one end, but otherwise they look just sort of like these little worms. So you'll often, again, find the larvae inside. If you find these tunnels, you find the holes on the outside, that is, again, almost certainly black fig fly. The best way to confirm is cutting open that fruit, taking a look, and seeing if it does have these little tunnels going throughout it. When it comes to monitoring for black fig fly, again, you're looking for all those figs falling on the ground like the ones you see in my hand right here. Monitoring, though, is really, really important since black fig fly is hard to manage and it is still spreading, so keeping an eye out for it is really, really important. Monitor populations with McPhail traps, like the one that's pictured up in here. Little hole in the bottom, they fly in, they get caught inside of it, and you can see what's happening. You can bait them with Torula yeast, which is attractive to the black fig fly, but is also attractive to a lot of other flies. So that's kind of problematic because you get a lot of bycatch, and telling the flies apart is hard because black fig flies just look like little black flies. So that's a little bit difficult, but you will catch black fig flies this way. So right now, this is kind of one of the main standards a lot of people are using. There's research ongoing on more effective lures with less bycatch. This is being done by Melissa Thayer at UCR. They basically found that germicrene D and hexanol was quite effective. You get a lot less bycatch that way. So there is research efforts going into this as ways to sort of, actually more accurately find a black fig fly is present. As far as I'm aware, though, this is not yet ready for commercial use and is still kind of in the more preliminary stages. So right now, Torula yeast seems to be one of the main things that people are using to try to catch and see if black fig flies are present. And again, look for those fallen fruit, look for exit holes in the fruit and cut those open, look for the tunnels and the larvae, again, like you can see in the picture in the bottom right here. Last thing, when it comes to management for black fig fly, again, here's another picture of what some of those tunnels might look like on the inside. There's very few good options currently, and that means that prevention and sanitation are key. So I don't imagine most of you are fig growers. If you are, this is of course very important. I hope you're already aware of this, but a lot of people have these in their backyards, figs growing around here. A lot of people who I deal with in Southern California are either small scale fig producers or people who just have this in their backyard and they're looking for ways to try to manage this. So unfortunately, a lot of this is going to be geared more towards small scale producers because it's labor intensive. So here are the labor intensive options that are available right now for black fig fly, and that's bagging young fruits individually. Obviously not very feasible on a really large scale, but if you have small scale stuff, it can work. So covering those fruits with an organza bag prevents any of the fruit flies from getting to it in the first place and laying eggs in it. You have to do this when they're quite young, though, because unripe fruit will still be attacked by black fig fly. So you got to get them quite early, but if you do this, it is actually pretty effective. You also, just like for the previous invasive fruit flies, you want to dispose of any fallen fruit. So if you find a bunch of those unripe fruit that are fallen to the ground, you want to act quickly and get those up, get rid of them, because otherwise the larvae that are in them will already be dropping to the ground and beginning to pupate. So clean up those fruit right away. That'll help reduce populations, reduce the number of black fig flies that are out there. You can also do things like trying to put up plastic mulch under trees to prevent pupation. Again, labor intensive. No one has really tried this or validated it with data as far as I'm aware, but this is kind of just a thing that we're throwing out to say this might work and could help prevent pupation as well. Beyond that, insecticidal baits, just like the ones that were used for the invasive fruit flies, GF120 Naturalite with spinosad, are somewhat effective if the adults are present, just like with the other fruit flies, but this isn't a super targeted approach. So it will work, but it's not something that is like specifically used to target black fig fly, but this is basically the options that we have right now. Research is ongoing, and hopefully there are some more options coming soon, but it is a slow process, unfortunately. As of right now, most of the options are a little bit hit or miss or are quite labor intensive when it comes to managing black fig fly. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions if I have any time left. My email is also down below. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions if you don't get a chance to ask them here. And thank you.